So now I would like to introduce Professor David Lloyd. It's a pleasure for me to do so. It's his second visit to Luther College. When I was a grad student, his books were one of those that really got me excited about Buddhist philosophy, so I'm happy that he's with us today. He's published a lot. There are a couple of the books here. He actually has had a Luther-like experience. He got his BA from Carleton College. He got his PhD from NUS, the National University of Singapore. He spent a lot of time in Japan, 15 years in Kamakura. He's been a very accomplished writer, as leader of workshops, a professor. Just some of the highlight of his books is the book Non-Dualism, that was one of the books that inspired me. That's not here. The one that people like most for the title is Money, Sex, War, and Karma. A very interesting book that is coming out again now is the Buddhist History of the West, Studies in Lack. It's a Buddhist take on how we do history. And one of the ones that resonate with the topic of sustainability, that is a topic that we embrace at Luther College, is this book on eco-dharma. If I mention all these books, we won't have too much of a time for the talk, so without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor David Lloyd, who will talk to us today about transforming self, transforming world. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Kopp, for that very warm introduction, Bulgarian. I'm very delighted to be back here. Thank you also to Professor Green, wherever you may be, for your introduction as well. I'm very pleased to be back here and very pleased to be talking about this particular topic, which is of great interest to me. What's the relationship between our own personal self-transformation and the kind of social transformation that many of us feel is becoming increasingly obviously necessary. Another possible title for this talk would be, wait a minute, I got to turn the microphone on, don't I? Let's try this. How's this? Any better? Okay. Do I repeat all that? Anyway, another possible title for this talk might be something like Why Buddhism and the West, or Why Buddhism and the Modern World Need Each Other. Because that's going to be the basic theme, the idea that when we look at the history of the West, there's been this emphasis, as is the way it's developed, on social justice, something that has not been an important part of the Buddhist tradition, at least not until very recently. And yet, so Buddhism has concentrated more on the self-transformation, and it seems to me that our Western tradition more on social institutional transformation. I'm thinking particularly here of something that Gary Snyder, the Zen poet, published about 50 years ago. He wrote an essay called Buddhist Anarchism that included these words, see if I can remember. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been individual insight into the basic self/void. Or I think now we might say insight into the emptiness of the self. And then he finished by saying, we need both. Another way to say that, I think, as I've already sort of alluded to, is that the way the Western tradition, the focus has been on social transformation, transforming our institutions so they're more socially just. And I think probably all of us here are very aware of many ways in which we fall short of that ideal. But I think we also need to appreciate just how much has been accomplished in a relatively short period of time, in just a few hundred years. I mean, I'm thinking how the modern era really begins with the Christian Reformation in Europe, not that long ago, which brought about religious freedom. And soon thereafter, we had a number of political revolutions, starting with the English, the American, the the French and so forth. So overthrowing dictators, getting something like democracy with slowly extending franchise. And then it goes on and on from there. Anti-slavery movement in early 19th century, and more recently civil rights movement. Union movements, socialist movements, to sort of in response to different types of economic oppression. More recently, gender issues, women's rights, and now, just in the last generation or two, gay rights, transgender rights. I mean, when you put all that together, and you realize that like 200 or 300 years is just a blip in human history, that's an extraordinary transformation. A lot has been achieved in terms of social justice, and yet, as I think we're all aware, so much more needs to be done. And in fact, in some ways, I think we also feel that we're kind of going in the wrong direction, as if there's been pushback, right? In particular, I'm thinking about the growing gap between rich and poor in this country, which is already astronomical, almost inconceivable, and yet it continues to get worse. So that's one of the questions for the talk. Why we've achieved so much toward this ideal, what's limiting us from going further? Please put that in the back of your minds for the moment, right? On the other side, when we look at the Buddhist tradition, as I said, Buddhism traditionally has not focused on social justice, and I'll have more to say about that. Rather, the focus has been on individual, personal, self-transformation. The idea being that in our usual deluded situation, there's a lot of suffering, but that there are ways to work in ourselves, including meditation, for example, that can lead to insight, that can liberate us from a lot of that transformation. And Gary Snyder says that we need both the social and the individual. And I think that's true. True not only in the sense that those two transformations go well together, but I think moreover we can say, I think we can see today that each of those projects, each of those processes of transformation actually needs the other if it's going to be as successful as we need it to be. And that's, in a way, one of the big themes of what I want to talk about today. Are you with me so far? Does this make sense? I want to start out by contrasting the spiritual roots of the Western tradition with Buddhism. And I want to do that by focusing on one thing in particular, morality, or you could say social ethics, right? And I'm not interested in the content of morality. Like, for example, we have, in the Abrahamic, we have the 10 Commandments, and in Buddhism we have the 5 precepts. I'm not so much interested in comparing them. As you would imagine, there's some similarities and some differences. What I'm really interested in, though, is in the function of morality, or the role of morality. Because the really important point that I want to make is I think it's very different. I think that for the Abrahamic tradition, what we might call the duality between good and evil is sort of at the heart of the tradition. And that's not the case for Buddhism. And that's a very illuminating sort of contrast. Right? I mean, for the Abrahamic traditions, by which I'm referring, of course, primarily to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? For all of them, there's a creator God who created us. And he not only created us, but he wants us to live in a certain kind of way. And the point being that if we live in the way that it's usually he, right? If we live in the way he wants us to, then there's some sense that he'll take care of us. And if we don't, if we disobey this kind of cosmic father, then bad things are going to happen to us, right? And I think this goes back all the way to the very beginning of human history, again, according to the Abrahamic traditions. The story of Adam and Eve, right? Think about it. They eat the forbidden apple, or the forbidden fruit, or the fruit from the forbidden tree, right? What's going on? There's an act of disobedience. They were warned, don't eat this from this tree, and they do it, and they suffer the consequences. I find that story interesting in a number of ways. And from a Buddhist perspective in particular, I think what's most interesting is what happens afterwards. The fact that after eating, they become aware that they're naked, right? And they have to get fig leaves to hide from the face of God. That suggests very strongly to me a metaphor for self-consciousness. They become self-conscious in a way that they weren't before, right? Before, they were not just in the garden, they were of it. They were sort of part of the garden. There was kind of non-dual experience. But once they become self-conscious, there's a sense of separation. Maybe we can even say that it's not that they're expelled from the garden, but that even by becoming self-conscious, there's a sense of alienation. Maybe. But that's not what the Abrahamic tradition emphasizes, right? The real important point there is the act of disobedience, that it's sinful to do something that God tells us not to do. And of course it carries on through so much of the rest of the tradition. Noah's flood, Noah's ark. Why does God send a flood that drowns almost everyone except for the people and the animals on the ark? Because we weren't living in the way that he wants us to. Again, it's an issue of morality, right? I always thought that was a bit hard on the animals that didn't get into the ark, you know. Were they really that evil? Did they deserve that fate? And also, I don't know about the marine animals, but if any of them were marine, they got off very easy, right? And it goes on. The Ten Commandments of Moses, you know, the covenant, that's really at the heart of the Jewish tradition. And then later Jesus. Now Jesus seems to me, he adds something new. He seems to have a more intimate relationship with God. He calls God Abba. I think that's Aramaic. And it's very, very personal, something like daddy or papa, so I'm told, right? And he seems to emphasize love more, although I'm not clear theologically how much that might be Paul's influence. But anyway, he's still, though, fundamentally a kind of, it seems to me, a sort of Jewish, prophet, wisdom teacher. And he's still emphasizing, you know, we've got to behave ourselves. We've got to live in the way that God wants us to, or we're going to get in a lot of trouble because the last days are coming soon, right? And now you're all wondering, well, why am I going on and on? Why is a Buddhist teacher, a Buddhist professor, going on and on about this good versus evil? For the simple reason that I think it's still our favorite story. It's still our favorite way of making sense of the world. It's still our favorite duality. And as evidence, and this will work better for some of the gray hairs in the audience, I grew up with James Bond, right? Think of James Bond. But not only James Bond, what about Star Wars? What about Lord of the Rings? What about Harry Potter? We love this story. You know, it's like we can never get enough of it. And I'm sure there's all kinds of other examples I'm forgetting. Likewise, you know, our favorite detective shows and so forth. We just enjoy it so much. And from a Buddhist perspective, however, there's something problematical about this story. There's something wonderful too, but there's also something problematical. So let me start with the problematical. Here's what I think the problem is. Good versus evil is really good, great. It's like the best possible example of what's sometimes called dualistic thinking or bipolar thinking. By that, I mean thinking that involves bipolar concepts. Things like big, small, tall, short, heavy, light. What's interesting about all of those examples is it seems like we have two concepts, right? Big, small. But if you think about it, actually, each of those needs the other. Each of those has meaning only in opposition to the other. Like, if you don't understand the word big, you don't really understand the word small. Because small is that which is not big. Big is that which is not small, right? I mean, so this is kind of an obvious logical point, that each of those depends upon the other. But what really makes this important is that this is not only logically important, logically true, but also psychologically important. Let me give you an example. pure, impure. That's a really good example, I think, of dualistic thinking. If the most important thing for you were, for example, to live a pure life, and by pure, it can mean whatever you want it to mean. If the most important thing for you is to live a pure life, what does that mean? Because of the non-duality of purity and impurity, it means that you are going to live a pure life. It means you're going to be preoccupied with impurity, with avoiding impurity. Because the whole concept of pure has no meaning except avoiding impurity. And impurity has no meaning except not pure. And so you can't have one without the other. So if you want to live a pure life, it means you're going to be stuck, or you're going to be preoccupied with this duality. You're going to have to make these decisions all the time. Evaluate every situation. Is this action pure or impure? You see, you can't have one without the other. And in the Zen world, we talk about sort of binding ourselves without a rope, how this dualistic way of thinking can become really problematical, right? Which is why one of the great Chan or Zen masters, Hu Hai, famously said that true purity is to live a life beyond the duality of purity and impurity. Does that make sense? But what about good versus evil? As I said, I think that's perhaps the best example and the most problematical example of this kind of dualistic thinking. Let's go back to James Bond. How do we know James Bond is a good guy? That's what I want to know, right? I mean, think about it. He likes to drive cars too fast. He drinks a lot, shaken, not stirred, right? He gambles. He loves to gamble. He has a lot of women, casual relations. Most of them die somewhere in the movie, right? Right? You see the pattern. How do we know he's a good guy? I mean, by a lot of standards, some people would think he's not such a nice guy. How do we know he's a good guy? Because he's fighting against the bad guys. And that's what makes him a good guy, you see. The problem with good versus evil is that you don't know what's good until you know what's evil. That's why Christianity, in order to have a God who's all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful, you've got to have a negative principle. You've got to bring in the evil principle, Satan or the devil or something like that, to sort of counteract it. And in the case of good versus evil with us, if you want to be good, it really helps a lot if you're fighting against the evil, right? That's how we often feel good about ourselves, right? Which brings me to my next example. Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush. What was the difference between them? Weren't they both fighting the same holy war of good against evil? Of course, what the one thought was good, the other thought was evil, so there's kind of a reversal here. But each of them thought that he was good, and as part of that goodness, it was to fight against the others who were evil, and because they were evil, they could be destroyed. In fact, once you've labeled something as evil, you don't have to understand it, you shouldn't negotiate with it. It's simply clear as much as possible if you can destroy that. I mean, I'm not taking sides in terms of, which one to identify with, but I'm making the point how, in a way, they're both caught up in this duality of good versus evil. And I think this points to one of the tragic aspects of history, especially in the Western tradition. One of the main causes of evil in the world has been our attempts to get rid of evil. Think about the history of Christianity in Europe. Think about inquisitions, heresy trials, witchcraft trials. Think about what the Christian nations of Europe did in the New World, how they responded to the religions there, labeling them as satanic and seeing their job as to destroy them. Right? But we don't have to go back in history. This can be more modern as well. What was Hitler trying to do? He was trying to purify the earth. I don't know whether we call the Jews evil, but in effect, that's what he was thinking. He wants to purify the earth by getting rid of the impure elements. He wants to have the Aryan race, the pure Aryan race, by destroying the non-Aryans. What about Stalin in the Soviet Union? With the kulaks, the better off peasants, or Mao Zedong in China with the landlords. They're all caught up in this same duality of good versus evil. They're trying to create a perfect society by destroying the elements that they think are problematical within the society. And the irony, of course, as we can see, is that they end up creating horrible societies by trying to purify them, by trying to create perfect ones. So this is, I'm trying to point to the problem, the danger, at least, with this duality of good versus evil. Does it make sense? But there's also something really wonderful about it that connects with our concern for social justice. And here, I would trace it back, not only, but I think it's very strong, going back to the Hebrew prophets. What were they doing? Well, one of the big things they were doing is that they were going to the rulers, the kings usually, right? They would go up to the rulers and they would say, you are not acting in the way that God wants you to. You are oppressing the poor and the widows and the orphans, and you shouldn't do it, and God's going to punish you for it. And then, having spoken truth to power, they would run back to their flocks in the hills, right? Because you got to be careful. So, what's going on with this? I mean, they're in a way laying the groundwork for this principle that kings, rulers, states, they just can't do what they want, or rather, they have a responsibility too, right? They have a responsibility to the people, that the rulers, the governors, those in charge of the society are measured, evaluated by the same morality as anyone else. And that seems obvious today because we are the beneficiaries of that tradition. But if you look back in ancient history and how rulers have behaved, they haven't always behaved in that way, nor has it always been the case that they've been expected to behave that way, right? So there's this new concern for justice. I mean, I don't want to say that these prophets were the only ones who started it, but in terms of our own tradition, given that it's in the Old Testament for Christians, it really became very important. And especially when you bring this concern, the prophetic concern for social justice, with the other source of the Western tradition, which is classical Greece. Because what did the Greeks realize? They realized that if we don't like the way that our society is structured, we can restructure it. Again, something we take for granted today, but most societies, they just take their society for granted. And the Greeks realized, no, we've got a problem, we're going to create something new, democracy. Not necessarily a very good democracy by our standards, no women slaves apply, but nonetheless, this fundamental realization that, hey, we have the ability to transform how we live together. So bring that realization together with the Hebrew concern for social justice, bring it together in the modern world, and boom, we see these things that I was referring to earlier, these concerns for social justice, and all the things that have been accomplished in the last few hundred years, right? It seems to me I'm trying to give you a kind of much too simple origin story, but there's really something important to this about how this has influenced the way that modernity has developed. And as a result of this, we now live in an almost perfect society. No? Am I getting some pushback on that? It's interesting. As I said, we have some sense, we've accomplished a lot, but we also have a very strong sense of resistance to it, and even pushback. And it's really worth asking, where does that come from? What's going on there? It's interesting how we talk a lot about democracy and the importance of democracy, as we should. But democracy in and of itself guarantees nothing, because it depends on the quality of the people who are voting or participating in the democratic process, right? In Buddhism, especially early Buddhism, we talk a lot about what's called the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion, right? And how when what we do is motivated by these three poisons, creates bad karma, bad things happen to us. So consider, if the people, put it this way, suppose we lived in the most perfect possible society, economically and politically, whatever that might be, but you and I and many people in that society were still motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion. How well is that perfect society going to work? You see? The point being, are social structures, our institutions in and of themselves sufficient to guarantee what we want to accomplish, and how much, I think you can see where I'm going with this, right? How much is the institutionalization of social transformation, how successful can that be unless there's also some personal transformation as well? Or to say it another way, supposing that you are a revolutionary leader and you've just overthrown some really nasty dictator, and now you have supreme power. But if you still have greed, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be very difficult to avoid taking advantage of your new situation, right? Or if you still have ill will, how strong the temptation to label people who have different ideas, who oppose you in any way, to label them as enemies, to be destroyed or imprisoned or limited in some way. And likewise, if you have delusion, especially the delusion of ego, the delusion that I'm the one who understands what needs to happen and everyone else should just do what I say and everything will be fine. Okay, supposing you have these greed, ill will, delusion, how well is this new revolutionary society going to work out, right? Does this help us understand why so often revolutions involve replacing one gang of thugs with another? Excuse me a moment. So that's the first half of my argument. As wonderful as the Western tradition has been in terms of institutionalizing reforms that make the world a better place, more socially just, that institutionalization in and of itself is insufficient to get us where we need to go, right? You with me so far? But let me shift to the other side. Let me talk a little bit about Buddhism, right? You remember I started out, I want to do a contrast, and I started out by talking about how good versus evil, I think, is central in the Abrahamic tradition in a way that it's not for Buddhism. Buddhism has precepts, sure, but there's always a sense in Buddhism that the precepts are something like the training wheels in a bicycle, you know, very helpful at the beginning. The point being, if you really know how to ride a bike, the training wheels just kind of get in the way. And if in Buddhism you really have insight or awakening or transformed by Buddhist practice, then you don't have to worry so much about the precepts because you naturally won't want to take advantage of other people. That's the principle anyway. There seems like we have quite a few counterexamples, but I don't want to get into that at the moment. So, whereas in the Abrahamic, it's like good versus evil, sin, redemption. For Buddhism, it's delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus awakening. And the key problem is not sin, it's dukkha. Dukkha is the Pali, the original term. And let me just do a little reality check here. How many of you are familiar with the term dukkha? Mostly the Buddhists in the front here, right? Right. Dukkha is the word usually translated into English as suffering. But that works only if you understand it in the broadest possible sense. Not just physical and mental pain, but frustration, dissatisfaction, anxiety, dis-ease. Right? we tend to think that if we just solve our problems and get all the stuff we want, we'll be happy. And I think the real point of dukkha is that it's not that simple, that it's the nature of our unawakened minds to be bothered by something. Right? That's really what dukkha is pointing to here. The really important and interesting question in this context is, well, what I need to say first is just to emphasize how central this is for Buddhism, right? If you know anything about the Four Noble Truths in early Buddhism, they're all about dukkha. Dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, the Eightfold Path to end dukkha. And the Buddha himself was very explicit, saying what he taught was simply dukkha and how to end it. So that's like, it's the most central concept in Buddhism, especially early, or most obviously in early Buddhism, right? But then we get this really interesting question, what kinds of dukkha was the Buddha talking about, right? And the reason this is important is when I go back to the earliest Buddhist texts, I see, it seems to me, there's a very strong suggestion that the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the institution that formed after he died. By progressive, I mean, I think he had a lot of insight into what we might call structural dukkha, social dukkha, dukkha due to the way that society is arranged, which we would talk about in terms of social justice, right? That didn't become an important part of the Buddhist tradition for a reason I want to emphasize now, but I think the Buddha was very sensitive to it. In two ways in particular, there's two things that stand out for me. One of them is his attitude toward women, and the other one is his attitude toward caste, right? Which would be kind of the equivalent of kind of racism today, I think. Right? In the time of the Buddha, the situation of women in Vedic India, it was not good. Okay, women were basically subordinate to men's, whether their father, their husband, or their children, their whole lives. So they really, certainly in the Brahmanical tradition, they didn't have any spiritual role to play. So what the Buddha did, well, he did a lot of things for women. He understood marriage as more reciprocity where each side has responsibilities to the other. And he also did this amazing thing. He not only created a sangha, a community of monastics for men, he also created one for women, the Bhikkhuni Sangha. Truly extraordinary. Basically, based on the realization, shocking for its time, that women had the same Buddha nature, or let's say the same potential to awaken as men do. Whoa, right? So again, this is a real challenge to the kind of patriarchy that people in those days would have tended to take for granted. Now there's a very famous story of how the Buddha created this women's sangha. And it's very interesting because what it shows is that he was really, really reluctant to do it. He was followed by his foster mother, and she tried to talk, we really want a woman's sangha. He said, no, no, no. And finally, he was talked into it by his young cousin, Ananda, his attendant, right? And basically, simplifying what the attendant said, he said, well, don't women have the same potential to awaken as men? And the Buddha said, yes. And then Ananda said, well, why don't we create a women's sangha? And the Buddha said, okay. Kind of a weird story. I used to love this story because the Buddha allowed himself to be persuaded by his attendant, in something so important. And then I realized how foolish I was. That actually, that story is constructed the way it is to blame Ananda for creating the women's sangha. If you look at the Pali Canon as a whole, there's lots of stories about Ananda, and they almost always show him in a negative light. And you really get the sense there was a kind of power struggle going on, especially between Ananda and Kashyapa, the guy who basically took over the Sangha after the Buddha died. There was some, jealousy or some bad feeling. So it's pretty clear. There's also internal evidence within the story. I'm not going to go into details, but there's evidence strongly suggesting that the story as we have it never happened. It's been concocted later by the male monastics to sort of show that the Buddha really didn't want to create this, this Sangha for women, right? Yeah. Well, for one thing, here's one small problem. In the story, Ananda persuades the Buddha, but actually the Buddha created a monastic Sangha for women quite early in his teaching career. We can work out 7th or 8th year, right? But Ananda didn't come on the scene or become his attendant until much later in his life. So wait a minute, what's going on there? You know, it doesn't, and there's lots of other issues here. So it's important to realize that the story is problematical and very likely concocted by men to justify something. To justify what? Well, it's interesting that after the Buddha died, even though in the earliest teachings we have lots of evidence that women attained great enlightenment, they wrote songs and poems about their experience, but after the Buddha died, the women's Sangha, after a couple hundred years, it just faded away, it disappeared. And frankly, my sense is that the men didn't like the competition. And what happened? Basically, the patriarchy that I think the Buddha saw through, to a large degree, the patriarchy reasserted itself to the point that now every Asian Buddhist society is strongly patriarchal, even though I see that as inconsistent with what the Buddha himself was seeming to see, given what he said and given what he did. So there's an interesting little facet. Even more interesting to my mind is this attitude toward caste, right? You're all familiar with the caste system of India? 4 main castes: the Brahmins, the warrior caste, Kshatriya, which the Buddha was a member of, and a couple others, merchant and so forth. And then there's the outcasts, the untouchables. What's interesting is that when you join the Buddhist order, you lose all caste. You don't have a caste if you're a Buddhist monk or nun. Not only that, you're really not even supposed to talk about caste, really. And it's quite interesting because, you know, in caste, one of the most important things is who makes your food, who touches your food, who you eat with. And the Buddhist monks are mendicants. They're beggars. They go out every morning begging for food, right? And they're not allowed to discriminate. So that means you might have a guy who is a Brahmin, but he's going to the home of an untouchable begging for food. You know, that's kind of shocking stuff. There's none of that kind of priority in the Buddhist tradition. The only priority, and this is important, the only priority, and it's not, I say it's important for the point I want to make, but in fact, it's really not that important internally. The only priority is when you enter the order. So somebody who enters one day before somebody else, they have a certain kind of priority in certain situations. Like if you go to a new place, who decides where to sit first? Or who starts the eating? That's the sense in which there's a little bit of priority, right? You're a senior. Your seniority is determined by when you actually join the order, right? And that leads me to my all-time favorite story in the Pali Canon. And it's a story about 4 high caste men. I don't know if they were Brahmins or Kshatriyas, but they're out in the jungle or the forest, and they all decide that they want to join the Buddhist Sangha. So they turn to their servant, Upali. We say servant, actually, he's probably more like a slave. You know, he didn't have other options. But they turn to Upali and say, okay, Upali, we're going to give you our silk robes and clothes and jewelry because we're not going to need them anymore. We're going to be, you know, dressed in rags. What the Buddhist monks did, you know, they would sew rags together and wash and dye them. So we're not going to need these fancy clothes. But then Upali says, well, wait a minute, I can't take these clothes. I can't take your jewels. Suppose somebody sees me, what are they going to think? they're going to think I killed you or maybe at least stole them. They're not going to believe what I say. So what can I do? I know I'm going to come and I'm going to join the order too. So he goes with them. All 5 of them go to the Buddha. And that's the, and that's the interesting point. So they all go to the Buddha. And how does he respond? Well, we have to kind of read between the lines to get a sense of why he does what he does. But he looks at the 4 upper caste men. And does he ordain them? No. He sends them on a meditation retreat first. Why? Well, he's probably checking them out. I mean, these are spoiled young men. Do they really have what it takes to live like a monastic in the forest, you know? 1 meal a day, for God's sake, you know? So he doesn't ordain them. He sends them on a retreat. But what about Upali? What does he do to Upali? He doesn't send him on a retreat. He ordains him. Which means that Upali will be their senior in the Sangha until they die. He will be there, as it were, he will have priority over them. Because after the men come back, he does ordain them. But now they're all behind Upali. I just love that story. But what happened after the Buddha died? I mean, I see this as some sensitivity to social justice issues, right? Again, not only about women, but about caste. I don't know how much the Buddha was flaunting this, but there's some suggestion here. So, but after the Buddha died, what happened? Well, it's interesting the way things developed, right? So the Buddha's gone. That's very, you know, you're very sad. All you've got is the teachings that he left behind. But also you've got this new little cult. And it's got to survive, and it's got to thrive. And that means you've got to come to some accommodation with the rulers, with the kings. Because if they don't like what you're up to, they can squash you very easily. And also, according to a lot of the early records, the Sangha was partly dependent on royal support, giving them land and such. So it's kind of tricky. You want support from the powers that be. Well, in that case, you'd better support your powers that be, right? You're not going to challenge them, right? You know, maybe the king is the nastiest guy around. Maybe he really oppresses all his students. He gives them high taxes. He grabs all the young men for his army. He could be a really, really nasty guy, but he's also an important guy. He has power, and he better be on your side. So how do you finesse that? Well, it's interesting. Buddhism has a special teaching that helps you do a good job on that, that can help you a lot here. It's called the karma teaching. So that the way that you are born, your situation, your status, it's because of the things that you did in your past lifetimes. Which means, of course, that if you're born a prince and you're likely to become a king, well, you must have really good karma from your past lifetime, right? And presumably then we should obey you because of that karma. You're the one who deserves to be king. And if you're born poor, maybe in a situation where you're malnourished or maybe deformed in some way, diseased in some way, well, I'm sorry, but don't blame anybody else. You know, that must be from your past lifetime. And if you're born as a woman, well, I'm sorry. You know, you must have done something really bad in your past lifetime. But if you behave yourself, if you do what we men tell you to do, then there's a chance to be reborn as a man in your next lifetime. And then you can become a monk and follow the Buddhist path, right? You see where I'm getting at with this? How the karma teaching can be used and was used to kind of rationalize the social order, even though there's this strong suggestion in the earliest texts that the Buddha saw through, and there's other things I could have referred to, but the Buddha saw through the whole social structure. So not only did patriarchy reassert itself after the Buddha died, but basically Buddhism survived and thrived because it came to this accommodation with the state, with the kings. And we have to appreciate, now that was, in one way, it was a very wise move. We can appreciate that because of that, Buddhism developed what is undoubtedly the world's greatest collection of contemplative practices, meditation types, that can help us transform ourselves individually. But basically the way the tradition developed, your dukkha, your suffering, the tradition doesn't talk about the structural suffering that the kings inflicted. It talks about your karma from your past lifetimes, your situation today. It's because of the way your mind works. It's because of your karma. Don't blame anybody else. But in order to deal with that, Buddhism has done this wonderful job, again, of creating traditions that are really embodying these transformative practices that can really help us change ourselves. But what it meant, of course, was that Buddhism throughout Asia, because none of those societies was democratic, Buddhism throughout Asia couldn't develop that concern for social justice, right? It had to be very careful. It had to be very careful not to alienate the kings. In fact, a lot of the kings would see themselves as sort of bodhisattvas or Buddhas. Some of the Chinese emperors saw themselves as Buddhas, just by virtue of their position. And it's kind of tricky. If the all-power emperor says he's a Buddha, maybe you don't agree, but do you say so publicly? You got to be really careful. It could have consequences not only for you, but for your monastery, you see. But now, interestingly, Buddhism comes to the modern world. Buddhism comes to a world that, at least nominally, is more democratic, where there's more freedom of speech, freedom of religion, more possibility. And one of the really exciting things that's happening with this kind of cross-fertilization with the modern world is now some people are starting to develop what I think are the social implications of Buddhism, looking at what we might call institutionalized dukkha, social dukkha, structural dukkha. Right? People sometimes talk about structural violence. In Buddhist terms, we can talk about structural dukkha, that is to say, dukkha caused by the institutions of society. Right? And this is new. I once heard a Tibetan teacher muse publicly. He said, "Oh, what terrible karma all those Jews in Europe must have had during the time of Hitler, to be born at that time." And I thought, oh my goodness, that fits in with a certain narrow understanding of Buddhism, yes, but that's simply unacceptable. Unacceptable. Blaming the victims, for God's sake, that's just not something we should tolerate anymore. We really need to expand our understanding of dukkha and how dukkha is created by the way society is organized as well. It's not always due to our personal lives, right? Just to give you one quick example, I've already referred to what are called the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion, and how when what we do is motivated by them, it creates bad karma, it creates dukkha. One way to look at a kind of Buddhist social analysis is to ask, have we institutionalized these? And without going into detail, let me just say that I think our economic system, with this emphasis on consumerism, consumers never consume enough, corporations are never big enough, GNP is never large. I think our economic system is institutionalized greed. I think our militarism, the United States is by far, if you measure in terms of money, we are by far the most militarized society in human history. I think our militarism is institutionalized ill will. And the problem is, if you spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on your military, you've got to keep finding enemies once in a while. You've got to fight wars once in a while. And I also think we've institutionalized delusion. not only the fake news that some people talk about all the time, but even the whole way that the media use advertising to keep us persuaded that the next thing we buy is going to make us happy. Keep us caught up in that kind of consumerist bubble. I think all three of those have been institutionalized, and that could be understood as kind of like the heart or the source of the kind of Buddhist social theory, Buddhist critique of the situation we're in now. Anyway, I hope you can see where I've gone with this talk. Basically, what I've tried to do is really talk about what might be considered the two kinds of freedom and the importance of both of them. Now, institutionally, we talk so much about changing laws to make people more free, and how important, I'm not trivializing the importance of that, the role of the legal process, the structural process for freedom. At the same time, it's important to realize that that in and of itself is insufficient. I'm thinking of somebody in particular, somebody very wealthy, also very, very powerful, who is often in the news. And it's quite interesting. He's so wealthy and powerful, and yet he's so obviously a very unhappy man. He craves attention. He craves respect in a way that he never gets enough of, and you sense that he never will get enough of. So, I mean, that shows us wealth and power in and of itself. What's the old joke? You can tell what God thinks about money by the people he gives it to. Something like that, right? So there's one type of freedom, but think about the other kind of freedom. Think about maybe a monk in Myanmar, in Burma, who, until recently, and I think to a large extent it's still true, a very oppressive political situation. It was controlled by a military junta that basically exploited the country, extracted and used a lot of its wealth for their own sake. Now, you might be a very enlightened monk. You might be very deep in your practice and you've learned a lot, but you're living in a society where you can't speak clearly, where your family is probably oppressed. Maybe you don't get enough food. Where the men and the women are pressed into the army and used in various kinds of ways, you see. So this kind of freedom, the social political freedom, is also very important. And this brings me to where I started, that what I'm basically arguing, and what I hope I've persuaded you, or at least got you to think about, is that we need not only personal transformation, we also need social transformation. And we not only need social transformation, we need personal transformation, and those have to happen together if we're going to start to move toward this kind of society that we would all like to live in. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, David, for your inspiring talk. And I have time for question and answer, and I want to emphasize, actually, first we would invite students to ask questions, but afterwards everyone. It's very important. We would like to solicit questions. We're not trying to solicit commentary or additional speeches. So the speeches can follow afterwards our freer discussion and the reception. So please, if you have questions, formulate them to the point. We'd like to start.
So please keep it short, is what I'm saying. Right. Yes, ma'am. Or yes, sir. Ma'am. Sorry.
I'd like to hear you talk a bit more to connect the end of the beginning there, how Buddhism and the inner freedom it cultivates, the specific ways in which it counteracts the bipolar thinking that you began discussing with good and evil.
Nothing comes to mind right now, so can you say a bit more about where the question is coming from?
Oh, that's you sort of set that up as the big problem with the Western conception of
got it.
behavior.
Got it. Okay, right. Well, it's interesting. Like I said, in Buddhism too, we have a kind of good and evil, but it's interesting, the Buddha didn't really talk in those terms. he talked about skillful and unskillful, which has a rather different valence, doesn't it? It's like some acts are skillful, some are unskillful because they cause suffering, because they cause dukkha. And so it's not so much, I mean, I think to some extent it also reflects something that is said in Christianity, I believe. What is it? Hate the sin but not the sinner. The sense that we're all implicated, rather than seeing the world in stark good versus evil terms, right? And let's be frank, there are some fundamentalists in all traditions who see the world as this great battleground of the good against the evil, and that's what's acting out here, right? For Buddhism, it's much more a sense that what we have is a kind of network of delusion that we're all sort of implicated in and we're all part of. And the Buddhist path is about sort of freeing ourselves from our own delusion so that we can see how that's working and help free other people as well. Traditionally, Buddhism has this emphasis on the Bodhisattva path, which means helping other people, but it's usually been understood individually, whereas one of the really important developments of a social theory is the realization that it's not sufficient just to help people one by one, but we also have to find ways to address the structure. For example, climate change. Like everyone says, reducing our own carbon footprint is important, but there's no way that's going to be enough, like Wilbur Kibben said. We also need to look at the political system and the role of fossil fuel corporations in maintaining the present system and finding ways to counteract that, to shift to renewables, right? So it's not just enough to change our own habits, our own consumption habits. We also have to look at the way society is structured. Yeah. Does that help? Thank you.
Yeah, so I found it very interesting how you connected the tradition in this aim to sort of describe social problems through this notion of suffering. And I was wondering if, in terms of sort of what comes next, whether you were using an earthly Buddhist approach or let's get rid of suffering, and how like the next steps would change if we talk about it through other traditions, through other Buddhist traditions that don't necessarily go straight to let's get rid of suffering. If that makes any sense, like how would you?
I mean, I think, yeah, early Buddhism is more explicit in terms of talking about dukkha and the end of dukkha. I think that that continues throughout the Buddhist tradition. It's just that they emphasize different things. Early Buddhism seems to emphasize more craving, right? Like in the Four Noble Truths, tanha, craving, thirst in the sense of a thirst that can never be satisfied. Whereas, say, in later, like say, I had a Zen teacher. He never talked about the Four Noble Truths. He never mentioned craving as the problem. It's conceptualizing. In other words, it's kind of the delusion of certain ways of thinking. So it's not as though the focus on dukkha disappears. It's simply, I think, a different emphasis of what the source of dukkha, what the cause of dukkha is. It's a very interesting question. How do we understand the difference in emphasis between craving and conceptualizing? And if we had more time, I'd go into it. I just think they're talking about the same thing, but emphasizing different aspects of it. And of course, one example of conceptualizing would be the dualistic thinking that I started off talking about. Yeah, I mean, I love to talk about Buddhism, and of course, there's no such thing, right? As you're implying, there's Buddhisms. There's many different types of Buddhisms, and so the kind of generalizations that I make are kind of tricky. I have to be somewhat careful. I'm not always as careful as I should be, but I think in this case, the kind of contrast that I was drawing more or less works. Please understand, it's a simplification, of course, but I think it explains something. Yeah. Is that okay? Anybody else?
I'm opening up now to everybody.
Yep.
Students and yes.
I didn't understand your
Myanmar. Okay. I wasn't talking about the present problem with the Rohingya. I mean, that's a huge issue. And sadly, what it reminds us is that, Buddhism too, on a popular level, when it becomes tribalistic, nationalistic, when it becomes an identity marker, our identity, we're Buddhists, you're not Buddhist, we're the good guys, you're the bad, Buddhism can fall back into the same realities and tribalisms as anything else that happened in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Civil War and so forth. I wasn't talking about that, but I was simply making the point that we can imagine somebody who's on a personal level deeply enlightened and yet living in a very oppressive society. And how some Buddhists might say, well, society's always going to be messed up and what's important is his own or her own inner freedom. And what I'm trying to say is no, that there are two issues here. Not just personal transformation, but we also need to be thinking about the social transformation. And of course, early Buddhism, they understood this world as samsara, right? The world of suffering, craving, delusion. And they didn't talk about transforming it. They talked about transcending it, escaping it. And I think we're in a situation now where that kind of thinking is dangerous, that we can't understand the path as simply a kind of escape from a world that's messed up, that we really need to take responsibility for what's happening and do our best to respond to that. Does that help? Thank you. Please.
I find myself being puzzled about what more formal Buddhist practice should be offering. And I think we all sense that we're living in dangerous and unique political times and dangerous and unique environmental times.
Right.
But Buddhism isn't a movement.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I also really hear very strong voices saying, well, Buddhist voices are just not showing up in social, questions of social injustice and so on.
Right. Right.
So I find myself not exactly knowing what arena to step into
Mm-hmm.
or how to step into an arena.
Right.
Do you have?
Yeah. Well, I think there are 2 points there. First of all, if we look at the Bodhisattva path, and maybe I should just mention, this is an understanding of the Buddhist path that developed a bit later after the Buddha died. But fundamentally what it means is we're working for our own awakening, not just for our own awakening, but in order to help the well-being, the awakening of everyone else as well. Right? So I think in some ways this may be the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer today, because the Bodhisattva has a double practice. He or she continues their own contemplative, their own meditation, koan study, whatever. At the same time, they know that's not sufficient, that they're also out there and engaged in the world, trying to address what's going on in the world. And what's really important, I think, is how each of those kind of supports the other. How, because bodhisattvas are grounded in a kind of meditative practice that enables them to act in the world without getting burned out or frustrated. In fact, to say it more clearly, it enables us to act without attachment to the results, which is really important given how often it's difficult to get positive results. Here's the big thing. I think still there's a lot of resistance in Buddhist communities to this understanding. I think the basic idea is still Buddhism is about your own personal transformation. And if I get engaged, well, that's kind of a distraction from what I really need to be working on. And I think that's the problem. I think we need to realize that engagement is just as important a part of our personal transformation as the meditation is. Engagement is how we embody, how we live out the kind of transformations, right? I mean, if you understand the path as seeing through the delusion of separation, like Thich Nhat Hanh said, we're here to see through the illusion of our separation. And awakening involves realizing a non-duality, a sense of oneness with other people in the world. Well, okay, maybe you have that realization, that's one thing to have that idea, but how do you actually integrate that into how you actually live? Well, guess what? Being socially engaged, right? One of my favorite quotations is by Nisargadatta. He said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love." Between these two, my life flows, right? I mean, love isn't just an emotional feeling. It's a way of being in the world that embodies the realization, the wisdom of our non-duality and our non-separation. But responding to the other part of your question, just very briefly, the problems we face today are so different from those in the time of the Buddha. There's nothing in the traditional Buddhist teachings that tells us what to do, right? Climate change, extinction events, democracy threatened. You can thumb through the Pali Canon, there's nowhere where the Buddha says this is what you should do, right? So Buddhism, as I understand it, implies we should be engaged, and it also tells us a lot about how to do it, but it doesn't tell us what to do. And that's where we have to use our own judgment in order to make that, and also to work together with other people to work on that. So I think that's the situation we're in today. The other thing I would add to that very briefly is a lot of American Buddhism, certainly in Zen, reflects the kind of extreme individualism of our culture, right? By far the most individualistic in human history. You know, so often in Zen, right? Go to a Zen center, you don't talk, you don't even look at each other in the eye, right? You're in meditation. You might hear a talk by the Roshi, you have a one-on-one maybe, then you, at the very end, you might have a cup of tea, but then you go home. Is this creating community? Is this creating enough sense of Sangha, right? The Buddha famously said, you know, this sense of Sangha, of spiritual friendship, is like the most important thing, but I don't think we're doing it. We have lots of Buddha teachers, we have lots of Dharma teachings, but when it comes to Sangha, I think there's still a long way to go. And frankly, that concerns me, because I think in the future, in the difficult times that I think are coming, the most important thing is not going to be whether we have a bag of lentils in the basement, but whether we're part of a loving community of people who are there for each other, who are willing to help each other. And you know, I just think we've really got to work, as Buddhists need to work on that, not with the sense of we're Buddhists, we're special, but in the sense of, you know, by working together, we can contribute more than by ourselves. Yeah. Does that help at all? How are we doing in time? Yes, yes, ma'am. In the back.
Hi, I really agree with your point of bringing the two ideas to work together. So I grew up with Buddhism for the first 13 years of my life in Cambodia, and then went to Singapore to an international school, UWC, if you've heard of it.
Say it again.
United World College.
Not only have I heard of it, I actually taught there once. I lived in Singapore for 7 years. I was invited to UWC to give some talks on Buddhism. What else, right? Yeah, yeah. I met my wife in Singapore. I love Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah, so I lived in Singapore for 5 years as well. So growing up in Cambodia, it was like, you know, Buddhism, and we were trying to avoid suffering, like exactly as you said. And then going to Singapore in my school, we were fostering this like change makers, go and, you know, do stuff in the world and try and take some actions. And then, so then when I go back home, it's really hard to explain to people like, we need to get involved, but then my grandparents would be like, no, we need to get out of it. But then to be a good person, actually, you know, to live as the best person you can be, and but not to get involved. So my question is, have you seen any like movement or anything that has worked in those kind of communities that really get people to be involved, but also still practice their beliefs? And if you haven't, do you have any suggestions how to do it? Because it's kind of one of like my biggest goals is to
Right.
go back and work with the community.
Well, you know, the situation in Cambodia is quite different than here, right? You have Hun Sen, who's a pretty, is there any microphone? He's a really nasty guy, right?
Yeah.
So for us to get politically engaged, we're not risking our lives in most cases, but you are in Cambodia. So it would feel very presumptuous for me to tell your parents and friends what to do. It's a very tricky, it's a much more tricky and complicated process there. I, I do feel some inspiration by some of the other liberation movements that have happened, like in Philippines, the way that the Catholics and some of the others worked as part of a movement to overthrow Marcos. And also in Cambodia, you had Mahagosananda, who was a really important monk that was inspiring a lot of the people after the war after the, what was the communist government you had there? Yeah, the Pol Pot and all that, yeah. It's a tricky thing, I guess. You know, we can look at the history of nonviolence and some lessons to be drawn by that. But the truth is, I'm not embodied enough in that particular culture to be able to provide much help there. I mean, I think when the Buddhist monks work together, as they sometimes have, like in Burma as well, I mean, they can really contribute. But I would feel terrible if I was suggesting something that went wrong, you know. Yeah. Again, I don't know that Buddhism tells us specifically what to do, but as I understand Buddhist teachings, it implies our engagement, our concern, right? The concern is dukkha, suffering, not only our own, the suffering of the world. What can we do to make the world a better place for everyone? And inevitably that implies some political and social consciousness, even if it's not clear from Buddhist teachings what is the best thing to do. What can I say? Good luck.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. As I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of something that I'm struggling with right now, trying to make sense of. And so I'm wondering if you might have some insight or recommendation. You talked about the West and East meeting each other in the context of social transformation and individual transformation, right? And I'm wondering, when I think about those two things, social transformation and individual transformation, I'm going to use the word, I'm going to make an assertion, a statement, and I'm going to use the word change to refer to both social and personal. As I'm trying to think about how to reconcile these two things, and I look at what's going on in the world around us, I look at society, I look at, you know, in the U.S., stuff that's happening, and it seems to me that oftentimes people talk about how demographics are changing, how the country is changing, and people being afraid and scared of the change that's taking place. But it seems to me that change itself, when I say change, I'm talking about social change now, right? Change itself is not what we're scared of. The change that we'll have to make, to accommodate that change is what we're scared of. And so I'm using the word change to refer to both, right?
Okay, right.
The social transformation. And again, as I look at how people are digging in and people are attacking each other and instability and polarization, it seems to me that the social change, the change itself, is not what really scares us. What scares us is the change we'll have to make to accommodate that change. Because if that change happens, some internal shit has to change, right? And all of us are going to have to change some internal stuff. And I think that scares people a lot more than the change itself. And so I'm wondering, which to me is bringing these two pieces together you're talking about, the internal, the personal, and the social, right? And if there are any thinkers or anything that's kind of grappling with the relationship between the internal change required in order, because again, we change the laws, we change all this other stuff,
Right.
as you already said, nothing really happens, right? But to accommodate that change, to support that change,
I can respond in terms of climate change, which is maybe something I know a bit more in this context, because I think it's fascinating that there's this split between people who see what's happening and how urgent the situation is, and how many people are denying what's coming down there. And I'm wondering if that's an example of what you're talking about here. I think most of us, to some extent, are in a state of denial, or maybe better, cognitive dissonance, in the sense that we know this is happening, and very quickly, and it has enormous consequences for us, for our children and their children and so forth. And yet, because we're not sure how to grapple with it, we tend to sort of still live in a kind of consumerist bubble where we still go on. On the one hand, we know the world is changing very quickly, and in ecological terms, not for the better. And yet, on the other hand, when we are planning for our future, we tend to kind of go along and think that in some way it's going to continue the way it has been. Our children think about their careers and so forth. So that I think is one example. And one important thing that's come out recently is when people get freaked out, when people really get afraid, one of our deep gut responses to that is to identify more tightly with that which gives us security. That is to say, our worldview and the circle of people that we identify with. And what's ironic about this is that can be a real contradiction, because you might be identifying with a group of people that deny climate change. But in a way, if you think, for example, that we're the greatest country in the history of the world, and we have the greatest economic system that's ever existed, and that's at the heart of your identity, then when someone comes along and says, well, this economic system, guess what, it's kind of destroying the earth, and we're really in bad shape, the tendency at some deep, mostly unconscious level, is to sort of go back and cling to that old worldview, because that gives you a kind of security. And I think this is at the heart of a lot of the resistance to what so many of us can see that's happening. Does that make any sense? You know, it's like we tend to believe what we tend to believe. We don't believe it because it's true. We believe it because the people we respect and that we identify with believe it. You know, that certainly works for religions when you grow up, right? But in general, that's what's true is what gives us a sense of security, because it's connected with this particular worldview. And that, I think, is a lot of the challenge. Now, whether that applies in the same way to something like some of the other challenges, especially racism, the whole problem of white supremacy, white privilege, and so forth, whether there's some of that same thing going on, you really sense, as a result of this election just 2 days ago, that the polarization is just really becoming very fixed, and there's a problem there. And I don't know whether what I've just said also helps us understand the kind of worldview that certain people are clinging to all the more tightly, because it gives them a sense of security. Does that speak in any way to what you're talking about? Yeah.
I would like to thank everyone for coming and for having a fantastic conversation. I would like, again, we can continue the conversation outside now at the reception. And please help me again to thank Professor David Lightworth